Everyone, welcome to a new episode of Carolyn Talks, the podcast slash YouTube channel where I speak to film creators about their work, the industry, and their art. And today I am joined by my guest, Lyle Kash, to discuss his new film, Death and Bowling. So, this is an experimental drama, and it's the first long form film about the trans community, directed and starring and crewed by members of the trans community. And it's going to be debuting at Outfest this year. So I'm going to talk to Lyle. And just before we get into the film, as usual, I like to have my filmmakers discuss a bit about themselves and what started them in the process of the films that we'll be discussing today. So Lyle, please.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for having me on today. I'm calling from LaGuardia on the way to the premiere right now. I also just wanted to make a quick correction. Maggots and Men, which is also a great film by Carrie Cronenwet, also had a majority trans cast and was cast and crewed. But so we're in a very short tradition and a small tradition, but I'm not the first. Death and Bowling sort of came about because I was dealing with a lot of themes of grief and transition, and I wanted to create a film that dealt with those themes without being so literal. So I started sort of with the grain of loss, brought some cast and crew on, and then the story sort of grew from there pretty organically.
First of all, thank you for correcting me about the other film. That I didn't know about it, so I'm glad you did.
Oh, good, yeah. Everyone should go check that one out as well.
Yes, please, if you can find it online, please do. So for the film, as I said, it's experimental, and I think it covers a lot of ground in the way that you shoot it, because to me there are two things that really stand out for me is the fact that a lot of it feels theatrical, almost like a stage production, but then there's moments where it feels hyper realistic. So it's almost existing in two spaces at the same time. So I wanted to talk to you first about building your groundwork for the framework for the film in that aspect, and like the fact of how you would film it and the process of filming it, and then how the story itself builds out from the structure of the film itself.
Yeah, totally. So I really wanted to present the story in a sort of, yeah, like you were saying, a theatrical way, a stylized way. Some of the performances are very artificial. And the reason for that is that I think there's such an impulse with queer and trans filmmaking right now to provide like authenticity and truth, which is great. I mean, there can be fictional films that do that. There's plenty of documentaries for sure that do that. But I think trans artists need to be welcomed into a fictional space where we can also be creative and imaginative and not always teaching someone something. I think that desire for truth and visibility can almost feel like ethnographic at times. And instead, like I'm sort of interested in fantasy, bridging the world between the surreal and the real. But then also I felt it's such an intensely trans film. I'm trans. Most of the cast and crew is trans, as you mentioned. And I wanted formally to reflect that. And gender is not real. It's a performance. And so I wanted layers of reality or non-reality to be present in the presentation. So in having a highly stylized film and in making it very clear that the actors at all times are performing, I'm reminding the audience this isn't a documentary. We're not presenting some truth about trans lives. And that's suggesting a way to read the film itself.
Right. You're just saying like this is a performance, and it's not, as you said, it's not a documentary. And it's also that you weren't trying to make this into some big treatise about the trans
No, yeah.
You're like, this is just a story that I'm telling, and I'm telling it in this very specific way to remind people, because I think it can, especially when we talk about representation, sometimes when we're watching films, we go into expecting like this really deep philosophical discussion, whether it's about gender, race, sexism, or anything like that. We're always expecting everything to have a deep meaning, where really truly it doesn't have to be. Where a film like this, it's just art. And it is what it is. And yes, you are dealing with themes about like the trans representation and that stuff, but at the end of the day, it is all just art, and it's a performance, and it's just a way for these members of the community to get a chance to express themselves in film and kind of like on stage too, because as I said, a lot of it felt almost like a almost like a Shakespearean play kind of sort of way. So I get what you're saying about that. And I'm going with regards to that, the set pieces, I thought the sets were very interesting. So there's a character that dies, and that's where the death of the bowling comes from, because this is Susan, and she runs the lesbian league bowling team, and a lot of it centers around her death. And there's this sequence where after her death is announced, like the members of the bowling league are still Like they're moving around the house and then they just go still. And this, I thought the props were very interesting because there is one moment where one woman's standing at the sink and the glass is overflowing. And then there's another where she's reading and she just stops. And I noticed like the plant pots next to her are empty. She's just surrounded by these empty clay plant pots. So I wanted to ask you about the set design and why you chose certain things for the specific scenes.
First of all, my art department was incredible. I mean, some of them are very close friends of mine, and some of them were people who just came on the project, yeah, to work on the film. And a huge priority in the set design was to reflect that same type of artificiality, but also to establish a sort of like trans poetics that if you're a visual person and you're looking at the images almost like a photograph, like you are, you're noticing details like that that should suggest either some type of formal transness, like a beautifully shaped plant, or something that has, perhaps a form that suggests a function that's not actually there. So, like an empty pot, someone's in the garden, potentially going to water things, but there's no plant, there's no there to water. And also just, images that sort of evoked grief for us as a team. But, similarly in the butcher scene, where Geo's sort of world is, all of that meat is very like clearly fake. And I think we wanted to suggest these sort of like layers of reality or non-reality and artificiality.
Yeah, there's and when and then I there's that, but then I also want to speak about a little bit about specific symbolism because the main character X, he's at home and he's dealing with his own idea of identity, which again, like for I think a lot of people think, okay, like once a trans person has made that shift and they've decided this is who I am, I'm gonna be either male or female, and he has the male identity, but he's still struggling with what next after I've made this decision. I've gone through the surgeries, I have the scars and all these things. And I think it was important that this film kind of addresses that because every human being, we are always constantly growing, we're always constantly going through changes. Like who we are today isn't who we are going to be tomorrow, and who we are 5 years from now isn't going to be who we are like 10 years ago. And like transitioning, I think transitioning doesn't only apply to the trans experience, but I think it just applies to like the human experience because we're always transitioning from jobs, our careers, our family dynamics, so I
Yes, the type of transition. Yeah.
yeah, so for his character, I saw that it was more like he's transitioning just as a person trying to figure out what's next, what's the next step for them. And something that really struck me with that, with again with the set design, is at home, like while he's contemplating all of these things, I noticed the family portraits are all hung upside down. So I wanted to ask you about that.
So yeah, on a bigger screen, I think if you're looking really closely, you can see them as family portraits, or when you get up close, one of them is Hillary Swank upside down.
Oh,
These were all people, all cisgender people who played trans characters in films. So he's like taken these portraits, spun them upside down, and sort of sits below them like a sort of a dark shrine to trans performance. Yeah.
yeah, that's actually, I think that's actually pretty smart because you saying that makes me think of Scarlett Johansson talking about she can play a tree or a transgender person. No, you can't. Stop
Yeah,
it.
no. Yeah, I mean, and this whole conversation is so like interesting and difficult because on the one hand, it's like I really loved Hilary Swank's performance in Boys Don't Cry. That's like one of the films that as a young trans person I really connected to, and today it even stands up when I watch her performance. It feels real to me. That character, Brandon, is like really brought to life in a way that feels like he could be someone I meet at a bar. At the same time, I think we sort of need to be taking power into account. But ideally, like trans people can also play cis people in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. And then kind of going from that, the thing is with we talk about transition, like the film again, like it kind of centers around the death of Susan, and I find I don't know what it is about humans. Maybe it's because we're I think like they say that we're the only creatures on Earth who are cognizant of our mortality and who are aware of the impending doom of death. But I find like for filmmakers and like writers and just artists in general, like we look at death as this way to like focus discussions like around death. And for this film there's X, but then there's also the character of Alex, who he finds out that Susan had a son and he had no idea. And then this is another person that then enters into his life that's making him question again like where he is in life. And so can you just talk a bit about the character of Alex and his place as a character, not only with X, but I find with also the other members of the bowling league, because he kind of like they all kind of like circle around him but never really interact with him until like the very end.
Yeah, totally. Well, I wanted to set up a sort of rivalry and a mirroring dynamic between Alex and X. I mean, this is such a sort of like commonly heard queer idea, um, that when you meet someone, you either like want to fuck them or be them. And I wanted that to exist, but I also wanted to sort of create this, in their relationship, sort of reflect this, this duality that queer family can, so many of our lovers become later on our best friends or referred to as brothers, or something sort of familial. And so I wanted those relationships to all exist in the relationship between Alex and X. And I think also I wanted, like you said, everyone's sort of circling around Alex. He's like a little bit of, there's not a lot of interaction with him until the end of the film after he's embraced. And that was also important to me. I wanted there to be a process of a queer community taking in this son by choice, even though he was the biological child of someone else. So sort of really I wanted to put right up front the value of queer family and queer community as the primary relationship of family. Secondarily, we have these like biological relationships, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does because I think for a lot of people, like found family is the most profound family. That's the family like when we choose the people that we are gonna call our family. I think sometimes that has more impact than like blood relations because not every blood relative is good for us. Like there's toxicity in a lot of families, and the people that we form connections with external from that are usually the people who are more helpful to us and um who are more, what's the word I'm looking for? Impactful. I think it's the word I'm looking for. Probably not, but who have more positive. I had the word and I forgot it in my brain. Who have
It's
more have a more positive impact on our lives. I love that idea of, because that's something that I love to see in film and in TV shows is the concept of found family and discussing that more, because I think as society, especially if we grew up in like the 80s or even before in the 90s, like and I'm from the Caribbean, like our thing is like respect your family, and like your family is like, blood is thicker than water. And then some like water is just as good for our bodies as blood is,
very important.
right? And so there's a line that X says that I wanted to ask you, not only for for the perspective of the character, but also from your own perspective, where he says he wants to be seen, but doesn't know if he wants to be had. So I wanted to ask you about the meaning of that line and like what that means for X and what it also means for you as the writer and the creator of the film too.
Yeah, so I think, thematically, the sort of layers of representation in this film and the fact that X is an actor, but also is trying to find a sense of belonging sort of in the world and his career, and also within this community that he's slightly outside of as like the only trans guy on a lesbian bowling league. So, but this idea of being seen, I'm kind of calling directly in this conversation about trans representation that's happening in the sort of like trans media activism sphere. And he asks a question like, in what he's constantly trying to understand, like in what ways he wants to be seen. Like, is it enough to just be on screen and have people watch him? Or is he saying, I would like to be seen, or is it that I'd like to be had? Does he want to be like possessed? Does he want to have the wool pulled over his eyes and tricked? Is he actually like a pawn of these, representation battles that are happening? What type of representation is he offering? So I wanted to, early in the film, open up in a sort of like poetic way this question of whether like all representation is good or like serves the actor exactly, and to say pretty directly, here's this actor who's performing as an actor on screen, telling you he wants to be seen, and then sort of shrinking back from it so that the audience members have to negotiate for themselves. Am I seeing this person, and in what ways?
Yeah, I think that kind of actually ties into, there's a scene at the very beginning of the film, like you do this kind of cold open where you have X and he's playing this role and they switch him out for a younger, thinner, more conventionally attractive actor. And I thought it was super interesting because like we see that in media all the time. And it's not only when you're talking about trans representation, you're talking about, if you're talking about colorism, if you're talking about representation for people of color, like Black, Asian, Latinx, like we see specific ideals or conventional ideals of what is attractive portray on in media, and then when you look around the people around you, you're like, the people that I'm surrounded by in my day-to-day life don't look anything like the actors and performers that we see on screen. So it's interesting that you have that dichotomy, and then you have X having um the same conundrum, where he's trying to figure out, like, how do I want to be seen and had as an actor, as a performer, and then also as myself as well.
That was really important to me to have a younger character, stunt double, who had to come on and had to get the chest scars painted so that he would look trans. And the younger piece of that, I mean, I just see this so often. People are talking about trans representation, but they want people on screen who read as trans. And so, adult trans guys, for instance, are not getting roles because to an audience, sometimes in interviews, the first question I've been getting is like, is the actor who plays Alex really trans? And the reason for that is he's got facial hair and he's a buff dude. And unless you're looking closely, maybe you're not seeing his top surgery scars. So it's like, my issue is like trans representation actually like looks so many different ways, but for a cis audience, we're supposed to look prepubescent and we're supposed to have really obvious scars. So I like the idea of bringing a much younger cisgender actor on who had that sort of baby face and could pass as a young trans guy, which is like the ideal of how we're supposed to present on screen.
Yeah, and it kind of does go back to what you were saying about the pictures representing characters played by people like Hilary Swank and those kind of actors. Because when you look at them, they all do fit a very specific physical ideal, right? And like you'd say it's androgynous, but it's like not really androgynous. It's just that they cut their hair, put a little contour and makeup to make them seem more masculine. When even in the back of your mind, you're telling yourself, I know this is Hilary Swank playing this role. Fantastic performance. But then at the back of your head, you're still telling you that this is just a woman that they just put on makeup and give a specific hair type to fit especially the director's ideal of what a trans person looks like. So it kind of does like goes into the whole idea of perception, and it talks about Hollywood conventionality, like what they decide who looks like who, which is kind of something that I think we've been dealing with Hollywood representation for so long, where there, especially when you talk about white directors and white creatives, like who gets to tell the world what people look like or what people should look like, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if this is in like, the text of the film, so to speak, but part of why I wanted a white lead is I think the question should also be like, what's at stake with representation? Like, is it like, here's this white actor, here's this white man who's being put on screen by a white director. Is representation really what's at stake? I'm not totally sure. I think some of these conversations about trans representation like don't lead to power for transgender people. They don't lead to change in these ways. They maybe reinscribe an idea of what like normative transness looks like. So even my film participates in that. I think it needs to be a sort of larger conversation when we're like waving this flag, that we're not just putting people in a position where they can become famous and rich. And so we have more trans people who can move through the class system. It's actually like, what are the stories we're telling? What are the themes we're telling? And are we navigating a power system deftly and with care and creativity?
Yeah, because I correct me if I'm wrong, but the only two actresses I know of are Laverne Cox, and that I should say that are black, and
MJ Rodriguez.
MJ Rodriguez. Thank you. They've had like great careers, but then it's like we still are waiting for more further, because like MJ only finally got nominated for an Emmy right as the show's ending, and people are like saying she should have been nominated from the first season, because she's been given like fantastic performances from the beginning. So it's just like you want Hollywood to be just like, just see people for who they are, and like just give them the recognition that they deserve. But it always seems like everything is so hard, like we have to fight so hard just for like that much space and recognition.
Totally. And I mean, just there's so much, transness on screen is such like a hot button issue right now. I mean, I think Disclosure, the documentary directed by Sam Fader that came out last year and is now streamable on Netflix, really deftly dealt with these themes and this history. But, like one of the things that needs to be said is that in the last 5 years, with this huge proliferation of seeing trans people, including trans women of color on screen, there has not been a decrease of violence towards trans women of color in the US. So I I really sort of struggle with like, geez, here, still here. I really sort of struggle with, what it's doing. I think trans representation is important. At 16, when I was going to like all girl private school, I would have loved to have seen trans men on screen. I could have imagined an adulthood for myself, but I think we need to like not overinflate what that does for trans liberation. Um, it's not the be all end all goal. I think representation in media, in politics, does not always translate to power for people.
Oh, it's true because then it depends on who's the person that has the power because there's some people whether even if they're saying that they're speaking up for people for marginalized people once they get that power it's like they shut the door behind them and they're like I've achieved my goal. The rest of you fend for yourself.
Well, and I think the cool thing is like Laverne Cox and MJ Rodriguez as examples haven't shut that door behind them. They're like hugely involved in community. Laverne Cox was the executive producer on Disclosure. I think there's sort of like possibly they're modeling in a really beautiful way what it can mean to be that representation for so many people and to still participate in community and show up in real ways. But yeah, I mean, I think this is part of the problem with the capitalist system, and the film industry is so, it's about profit. It's about, getting seen and your followers. So I think we just have to be sort of careful what we're fighting for exactly.
Yeah, and so I know we're gonna get ready to wrap because I know you're gonna soon have to depart. So my final question has to do with the final scene of the film, which is where Alex, we said Alex is he's embraced by the bowling team, and he bowls his ball, and it's being filmed by X and the other women are watching, but then at the end they go to look at the machine where the bowling balls come out, but no ball comes out and it's just spinning, and then they say their final goodbye to Susan, and I thought it was really poignant because it's like death is is this thing where we have this absence in our life for these people and you do have to say goodbye whereas that you're finally accepting that the person is gone but you're still in a way this is how I read the scene I just like me I'm just like super being like super deep right now but I saw that as just like you're still always kind of waiting for them to come back like you hear a phone call and like you're still waiting to hear this person's voice on the phone or you like get a sense a smell like sometimes I smell a certain dish and I imagine that I can hear my grandmother calling me, and I'm like, nah, she's been gone for like almost 15 years. So I wanted to ask you about that particular scene, about the symbolism of that for you and for the characters.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you sort of nailed it. I read the scene in a similar way. And, Alex throws the ball. And I think throughout, his sort of he's looking for his mom throughout that whole second half of the film, and I don't know that he finds her, but he does find this space that embraces her and tosses this ball that doesn't return to him. To me, it's also it's both poignant in a grief way. People who we lose don't return to us, especially in a death capacity, but also um, he doesn't really get what he's looking for, I think. I mean, depending on how you read the letter scene that precedes it, to me, that's sort of an ending in and of itself, that negotiation around the letter. And what happens afterwards, I think, can be understood in a number of ways, whether they actually go to the bowling alley and Alex is embraced in this way, sort of leaves it up for discussion. But I wanted to also call back to the moments in the desert and this idea that like a destination is not necessarily like an arrival or a there. And that also, for me is very formally trans. I think like this idea of like a non-linearity was at least somewhat reflected in the end of the film in that way. But also part of why I chose a bowling alley is that it reminded me a lot of the ocean. And I think like when we're looking at the ocean and we see waves, they return to us, they come back like the ball does. Bowling alleys are one of the only places where people orient their bodies all in one direction and look at a horizon. And so and this is like so abstract, it's ridiculous, but horizons and oceans and having people all stand in one direction like evoked a similar sort of feeling of grief and loss for me. So I wanted to sort of end with that image. And it also felt very queer to me. I mean, I think when all those women and Alex and X are looking over the ball machine, we're finally back at a moment of birth. I think there's something like very gynecological about that image in certain ways. It can be read that way. And So it's a moment of loss and grief, but it also sort of suggests the possibility of like a rebirth.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't think about it, but that makes sense. And actually, when you said it, the first thing that came to my mind is also when we were standing at a gravesite, that's also one of the few times, apart from a classroom perhaps, where everyone is looking in the same direction. And so, yeah, no, I kind of like that. Nice. So we're gonna wrap up now, and your film is, as we said at the beginning, is premiering at Outfest. So what does that mean for you to have your film premiering at a festival like this? Because not just any film festival, but one that's specifically about people from the queer community and people from the LGBTQ plus community.
It's so exciting, and Outfest has such a tremendous history. So um, it's an honor to be screening with them to begin with, but also the film was shot in LA, so it feels like a little bit of a homecoming for a lot of our cast and crew. And additionally, I'm just so happy to be screening at LGBT Film Festival because I think it's gonna the audience that screening is gonna be really fun and have a certain energy that at a broader film festival it could be different. I mean, I made the film for other trans people, for other queer and trans people, and I think obviously the themes of death and loss and family speak to a much wider group of people and a much wider audience, ideally. But it's a love letter to trans people, and I think the love letter will sort of get delivered on Sunday. So that's very exciting. We also have virtual tickets available, which I just wanted to sort of share with your audience. As long as you're in the US, you can stream the film for the 48 hours following our screening on Sunday at 11:30. So those tickets are like $10 and also on Outfest website. So hopefully we'll get a pretty big audience in the next couple of days.
Thank you so much for speaking to me.
Thank
This is
you.
so much fun, Lau. And I
So much
appreciate
fun.
you doing it in an airport with all the cacophony behind you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry. As a filmmaker, I feel bad about the audio issue, but I'm glad it worked out.
No, this is great. This is great. This is appreciated. And then, you know what? It kind of makes sense. This is the world we're living in now, where people are transitioning from airport and like this is life. This is how life is. Everything you can't structure everything perfectly.
No. All right. Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you so much. Have a safe flight, and I hope you have a fantastic time at the festival.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.